So this repair the guy brought in because the rear wheel has a lot of play in it. You can see it's sort of bouncing around on the axle. In a lot of cases you can just adjust the bearing cones and take the play out, but just to be sure, to make sure there's no bearings missing or something else isn't going on, it's usually a good idea to just go ahead and pull the wheel and take a look and make sure that everything is working properly. And it's also an opportunity to go in and re-grease everything. So let's get started. So I don't know if you caught it, but as I took the wheel off, the axle just fell right out of the hub because the axle is actually split right in half. It was actually only being held on by the tension of the nuts on the frame. So this was a potentially dangerous situation. So it's one of those times that it's good that we went ahead and took the extra time to take it off and examine it. So we're going to have to go ahead and replace the axle. We have a brand new one here. There's no real shortcuts for doing this sort of thing. You just have to go ahead and just do it by the numbers. One nice thing about this is that it has the captured bearings that are in the little frame, so you don't have to put individual bearings back into the hub. So let's go ahead and reassemble this thing and get this guy back on the road. Now this was an outer dust cover, so this is not any kind of major problem, that this can just be replaced. In fact, the new axle will have dust covers built onto it, so you don't have to worry about replacing them. What we do want to do is take a look at the bearings, make sure that the bearings are not damaged, and they all seem pretty well intact. It's also a good idea to check the bearing cups, which are the part on the inside here that the bearings ride inside of. One problem I've seen is that these sometimes they separate from the hub and start getting pushed inward towards the center of the hub, and it starts making the axle loose. And as you tighten it down to try to take up that slack, it just pushes it further and further in. So it's always a good idea to make sure that the bearing cups are still attached to the hub, so that they're not separating and starting to travel inward, which in this case it looks like it's just fine. So we're just going to go ahead and re-grease this up and start putting it back together. You'll notice with the new axle that there is a spacer. The spacer is going to go on the same side as the sprocket because it needs to clear the extra room that the sprocket takes up. So this will be on this side. So this will be on the opposite side of it. So we'll just go ahead and start putting this back together. Now, with installing a new one of these, it's good to have the old one on hand because you can sort of use that as a guide to see exactly where the cones were set up previously, so you don't have to spend a lot of time trying to readjust it. So I could take the previous installation and I could see that the inner cone was about that far in. I'm judging by the end of the bolt. You can see there it's about the same. So that's about where we want to have our bearing cup for this side of the wheel. Now, one thing I am noticing with this is that it has a much fatter nut on this one that's going to take up some more space than this particular one does. So it may be a good idea to put on a little bit of a fatter nut on our replacement to make sure that it is able to clear the sprocket when it comes out the other side of it. Now, with setting these up, these two nuts on the axle, the inner and the outer, like essentially you have the cone and then the nut, these need to be crimped against each other to sort of lock them in place. So you'll need what's called a cone wrench, which is a very narrow wrench that can grab the slots that are on the cone. So we're going to grab that with that, and then we're just going to essentially torque the two nuts against each other, which locks them in place so that they won't start moving around on the axle. And we'll have to do the same thing with the opposite side as well. So let's pick it up from there. For those of you that have been watching us before, you'll know that I like to use just an old turkey baster for greasing up the bearings. It makes it all a little bit cleaner than having to get your hands all dirty, so I can essentially just squirt it in where I need it, and saves a lot of time, and it keeps my hands clean, which I actually like. So there's the one side. I'm just going to flip it over, pretty much do the same thing to the opposite side. Go ahead and grease that all up. Put our bearings in there. This is our new cone nut. The new cone nut has a dust cover on the outside of it, which will keep dirt and crap from getting in there. On the other side of it, the bearings are pretty much protected by being inside of the cassette or the freewheel, whichever it is that you're using. In this case, it's a freewheel, so it doesn't need to have a separate dust cover on it. So we'll just go ahead and get this one snugged up. And you don't want to make these too snug, otherwise it'll just bind up the wheel and it won't turn very well. So you want to get a nice clean fit in there. Make sure that it's turning smoothly. And then we have our outer nut. And these two just jam right against each other. There's no spacer in between them. So this is just going to thread right on. And we're just going to, it just really needs to be finger tight. You don't really need a wrench to adjust the cone up against the bearing. If you're using any kind of wrench in order to tighten them, you're probably putting too much torque on them. So you want this to spin freely. There shouldn't be any kind of serious resistance to the axle spinning. So we go ahead and we get that in there, and then we're going to go ahead and lock it down using the cone wrench again. This one was going to need an even narrower cone wrench, so I was kind of cheating it on this particular one because I was using a wrench that's actually designed to be for removing pedals. But for the inside, I am going to have to use the actual cone wrench, which looks like this, because it's an extremely tight fit in there. And then we're going to go ahead and tighten that down. And that's that. And just make sure there's no play in it, that the axle is nice and smooth. There's a tiny bit of resistance just from the grease and stuff in there, but you don't want to have any kind of play in the axle. That's the important part. Now this is a freewheel, which can be distinguished from a cassette in that it threads down onto the hub rather than fitting onto some splines. So this has all of the parts built into it, where the cassette has the parts built into the hub. And we're going to use a special, this is a spline tool that just fits into there. This is what you need if you're going to be removing a freewheel from a bike. I'm just going to go ahead and torque it down. And the thing about these is that they're sort of self-torquing as they continue to put torque on the chain as they're riding. It's going to tighten it as well, so it sort of takes care of itself. But it's not a bad idea to put a little bit of torque on there to make sure that it's sitting properly. Now with installing a wheel, what I like to do is I like to set the derailleur into the highest gear or the furthest gear out, and then just simply lay the chain onto the sprocket and then just feed it up where it needs to go. It's about the quickest and easiest way to do it without getting your hands too greasy. If you put it on the lower gears, it can tend to be a little more of a pain in the neck to get it all lined up. So I like to just set it on the high gear, and then it's fairly easy to bolt everything back on. Now this particular guy, his brakes were poorly adjusted. You can see that it's just touching the edge of the rim, so I'm going to do him a little bit of a favor and readjust his brakes so that they actually are grabbing properly. So we got everything back on the bike. I want to just make sure that it cycles through all the gears. It's kind of hard to do with a camera strapped to your chest, so I have to do this incrementally here. But everything seems to be working good again. Make sure it cycles all the way down. I've got the brakes readjusted so that they're not just touching the edge of the rim, so that's working properly, and there's no play in the wheel anymore. The wheel is perfectly set up on there. So this guy is going to get a little more than he paid for. Obviously, we did fix the rear brakes for him. With a bike like this, I could probably spend another hour on it doing a fine tuning on the tune-up, but I think for the purposes of what this guy uses this bike for, I think it's good enough. And if he wants those extra services, they are available, and all you have to do is ask for them. So if you have a bike that needs some work, feel free to bring it on in. We'll be glad to take a look at it and give you a quick appraisal of the situation and get you back on the road. So until the next time, don't let the bastards get you down.